Let's talk about Dennis, or more specifically, the decline of his mental state. Or if you have a more positive outlook, the development of his character. The goal of this video is for me to attempt to diagnose Dennis. Although I'm not qualified to diagnose a real person, Dennis is a fictional character, and also, some psychiatrists give amphetamines to kindergartners, so it's not like they know everything to begin with. Anyway, I got really interested in making this video about half a year ago when I ran across this AMA that Glenn Howerton did, and saw some answers that made it seem like Dennis's personality arc was intentional even from the start. While it's somewhat common for actors to sort of fall into the role over time and allow the character to develop that way, these answers make it seem more like it was deliberate. So I decided to rewatch the whole series and take notes on every moment where Dennis's personality issues come to the surface, and any moments where we learn any potential reasons from his past for these personality issues. Also, after having watched the show for so long, I was really interested in the commonly repeated idea that Dennis is a psychopath or a sociopath or even a serial killer. So we'll also get an exploration of whether or not he actually is a psychopath. It turned into a pretty long endeavor, and in the end I actually came to a completely different conclusion than I thought I would going into it, and got a better idea of Dennis and his personality in the process. So in order to best recreate this experience, we're going to go through the series, season by season, episode by episode, and talk about and cover the way his character evolves throughout the show's life, starting all the way at the beginning of season 1. And before we get into it, know that I have to leave a lot of the smaller stuff out. My shorthand notes of everything I found while watching this video was almost 5,000 words in short bullet points, so I can't mention everything, but a lot of it's just reinforced personality traits that would be redundant if I were to mention every single moment. But I'm going to try to reduce it to the things I considered most when deciding what his diagnosis is. Keep in mind, this isn't definitive, and it's not the end-all be-all of his character arc or whatever. It's really just for fun, and I enjoyed my time doing it. With that out of the way, let's begin. So back in these older episodes, most of the characters are pretty similar. They're all sort of douchey and selfish. As the series goes on, their personalities change and become a lot more distinct. This is common for a lot of shows, but in order to really get an idea of what I mean, imagine a newcomer to the show sitting down and watching The Serial Defense, and then going back and watching episode 1. But even in these early episodes, the signs of Dennis's character being something of an anomaly are definitely here, and I was glad to see that. Based on many of the seemingly deliberate inclusions of small character insights, Glenn's claim holds up. Anyway, the most important things to note from season 1 are as follows. Self-admitted lack of convictions. Attraction to younger girls. Emotional trauma regarding someone stealing a woman from him, even very far in the past. Lack of emotion in front of a friend having cancer. High view of himself. Potential for an early childhood influence of questionable effect. Accusation of molestation. And a weird fixation on Charlie being molested. So just from this season, we can see a few of the common signs of antisocial personality disorder or even psychopathy, but it really wouldn't be enough, at least based on me eyeballing the hair psychopathy checklist. That being said, this checklist only really means anything if the subject scores more than 30 out of 40, whatever that means, and Dennis wouldn't really come close to that mark just based on season 1. But regardless of that, Glenn did say he wanted to tease it out, and this definitely looks like the case so far. Anyway, let's move on to season 2, where a few extra character traits appear for the first time, and we get some more insight into his past. Throughout season 2, we get our first real glimpse into his upbringing. His less than ideal relationship with his father, the fact that his mother seems to favor him over Dee, and the fact that his stuffed animal from his childhood seems far more important to him than his father. Well, now that we mentioned his mother, this is probably a good time to explore the character of his mother and the effect that might have had on him as a kid. In season 2, episode 2, Frank mentions that Barbara was not a very present mother, that most of the housework, cleaning, and raising of the kids was done by, quote, a series of Mexican women. This means he likely did not have a close connection to either of his parents, and Frank's mention of a series of women supports the idea that the individual raising him may have changed fairly often, which wouldn't make it too hard to believe that it might have led to an aversion of close relationships. I mean, if a kid's guardian is frequently changing, it's not hard to see the kid becoming afraid of attachment for fear of more heartbreak when they leave. Furthermore, Barbara seems to favor Dennis, which could lead to an early sense of entitlement. In fact, there's so much insight into his childhood packed into just this episode alone that it's definitely worth a much closer look if you want to explore this topic more. And it confirms the deliberate attention that they put into his character, and Barbara's. Then of course, in episode 3 of this season, we get the whole crack addiction thing in an attempt to get on welfare. And this definitely supports the idea that he's a potential psychopath, because basically 90% of people with antisocial personality disorder abuse drugs or alcohol, and it's pretty evident that he abuses alcohol. Even though his initial reason for doing crack was just an attempt at qualifying for welfare, his relationship to alcohol probably qualifies as abuse even at this point in the series. That said, abusing drugs like this isn't a guarantee of being a psychopath, but it supports the theory. Later on, we get to see our first real example of how Machiavellian Dennis is. In Season 2, Episode 4, Dennis emotionally manipulates the waitress in order to emotionally manipulate Charlie in an attempt to get out of work. Machiavellianism is a big part of his character in later seasons, and it shows up in full force as early as Season 2. Plus, later in Episode 4, we get an example of Barbara using Mac to try to make Frank jealous, doubling down on the type of role model she is and giving us a potential hereditary link to his manipulative ways. It's not even the first time Barbara did this, as she used the Israeli guy in Episode 2 in a similar way. There's also plenty of examples of Dennis's vanity in this season. Even though we got some of that from the first season, it's definitely reinforced here. From nearly crying after 2 different people tell him they don't find him attractive, to fasting for 3 days because he was worried about his face looking fat. There are plenty of examples here, but let's run through the smaller points of this season really fast. Season 2, Episode 1, Dennis shows his entitlement by feeling he deserves Frank's money, and later the stuff from his house, takes no responsibility for running over Charlie, and stronger attachment to a stuffed animal than his father. Season 2, Episode 4, immediately jumps to I gotta kill him when trying to come up with revenge. Season 2, Episode 5, willing to let Mac get beat up so he could profit, and tried to hide the money from Mac. Season 2, Episode 6, doesn't like kids and disregards their safety in order to win, but then again, so does everyone else. Episode 7, uses the news report he's on to basically just brag about himself, and lovingly remembers how he used to teabag Cricket. Episode 8, he was, quote, sent home for the statutory rape of a minor, but he says she was just a year younger and they just kissed. He's still very bothered and defensive about it, though. Episode 9, super into the idea of the process of Real Girls Gone Wild. Episode 10, quote, the kid's gonna die anyway, what difference does it make? Just a little fun one. And now we get to dig through the mountain of insight in Season 3. This season has several extremely notable episodes in it, so let's start from the top. In Episode 1, we get another big adventure into Dennis's scheming and Machiavellian ways. After being punked by some hippies, he engages in an extended plot to humiliate this hippie that involves posing as a hippie, presumably buying a large amount of weed, baiting the hippie into chaining himself to a tree, and then leaving said hippie chained to the tree while he does LSD with the guy's girlfriend and then bangs her. Which is a moment significant enough to him that it reappears later in the future episodes during flashback sequences. And to top it all off, he then shows up the next day and rubs it in by making him watch the bulldozers knock down the tree he was trying to protect. My cat just walked across my piano. This whole thing just speaks to how much pride he has in his Machiavellian ways and how personally he takes being insulted. He very clearly expresses a great deal of satisfaction in this whole ordeal, and it definitely pushes him much closer to the realm of sociopath if he didn't qualify already. In Episode 3, we see that he really isn't upset by his mother's death, and of course the weird party mansion escapades that basically would count as kidnapping or at least keeping people against their will. It's unclear whether this is some sort of strange way that he's coping with a reminder of his own mortality after his mother's death, because the entire gang seems to be worried about not having anyone to mourn them if they die, or if it was just a way to set up the scenario in the show, like in the writing process. I don't know, either way it's worth noting. The main thing in Episode 4 is that Dennis, and to be fair, pretty much everyone else, is willing to sacrifice the others immediately with little to no hesitation. That and his attempt at escape by means of seduction of Margaret. I guess that's something. And now we get to talk about Episode 5, and oh god, is there a lot to talk about. He states that he was a born winner, immediately insults Dee's admittedly bad drawing and attempts to one-up her, becomes extremely insulted when Dee says he's peaked. Still believes he is in his prime and has extreme confidence in his ability to sell the dress based on just the drawing. Presents an odd proposition to trade sex for the sale of said dress in a scene where his vanity levels are off the goddamn charts. Plus there's some weird, semi-rapey subtext within these lines.
Alright, let's just calm down. You're having a reaction. That's understandable. It's the nerd in you talking.
And, of course, this one.
Okay, look. I'm not going to take no for an answer because I just refuse to do that because I'm a winner. And winners, we don't listen to words like no or don't or stop.
Later tries to cover up his failed dress sale and says she ordered 25 dresses. Later blames the model in order to avoid all responsibility for why she doesn't want to buy the dress. This is arguably the earliest episode of him, believing he was a golden god and still is, but he doesn't say it in these words in this episode. But you could argue that this is like the first episode where that manifests. Moving on, continues to never blame himself or the dress and insists that no model is good enough. Lies again about the dress's success and makes up another order for 100 dresses this time, and in the end it's so upsetting to him that he was refused and that he believes no model is good enough that he snaps and dresses as a woman in an attempt to sell the dress. This whole episode is a tremendous acceleration of the darker aspects of his character, but speaks less to the psychopath angle and more towards severe or even crippling narcissism. In episode 6, he tries to seduce what ends up being a 12-year-old girl, but it's important to remember that nobody knew she was 12. He also seems to take specific pleasure from the idea that stealing the girl from Charlie would
ruining any hopes for happiness that son of a bitch ever had.
And he makes it quite clear that this aspect of it is his favorite part.
That's the best goddamn part.
Episode 7 contains an example of his selfishness, although it's an example of everyone else's selfishness too, because all of them are happy to screw Dee out of the potential money of selling the bar. We then get treated to more of his manipulative personality as he constantly abuses the fact that the waitress likes him to get away with anything while working at the restaurant she works at. And by the end, the corporate guy calls them all psychopaths, so yeah. Episode 8 has plenty about his character, but there's not much we haven't seen here before. Plenty of selfish behavior to be found. Also, he definitely does MDMA several times. Episode 9 doesn't really have much to note, so we'll skip it. But we can talk about episode 10, which is one of the main episodes I would imagine people would cite if they were to make the case for him actually being a serial killer. Starting off with this comment.
And dumb people are not capable of serial killing.
And it feels almost like there's a little bit of pride behind it, right? He then uses his sister as bait to catch a serial killer. Later, when they try to get into the mind of a serial killer, he has no trouble at all finding someone he would like to kill and proceeds to get very into character when thinking like a murderer, and even appears quite disappointed when he's reminded that they aren't really going to commit the murder. And I guess it's up for debate whether or not they killed Gary at the end. I mean, I didn't really consider that until I rewatched this episode for this video, but I guess, I don't know, we never hear anything else about it, so maybe. This is definitely the first episode where we really see some of the darker aspects of Dennis's character, and it makes sense why this might appear on people's list of reasons that Dennis might actually be a serial killer. And all that being said, and even though it's peculiar, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the fascination with serial killers and their mindset is the most incriminating thing in the world. I mean, lots of people do that, right? I'm not weird. Anyway, but plenty of his actions thus far have exhibited all of the traits of the Dark Triad, in at least some degree. And I guess this is a good place to talk about what exactly that is. The Dark Triad is basically a dramatic way of classifying the personality traits of Machiavellianism, which is basically the use of deception and manipulation in order to get what you want, narcissism, and psychopathy. People don't normally embody only one element of this trinity, though. It's usually a mix of all three, and we can see that when we're looking at Dennis. He's exhibited Machiavellianism in order to take revenge on the hippies. Narcissism is a fairly common thing throughout, but in particular it was the main motivation behind his attempt to sell the dress earlier. And psychopathy we haven't really seen one big example of, but instead plenty of smaller examples of his impulsive behavior, selfishness, and lack of remorse. But I think at this point it feels like psychopathy is actually the least present in Dennis, based on what we've looked at so far, which is honestly a little surprising to me. But if you're wanting to get an idea of my tally so far, he's leaning the most towards Machiavellianism and narcissism, but it's important to note that there's a lot of symptom overlap between narcissism and psychopathy. Like, a lot of these things go in both fucking categories. Moving on to episode 11, where we get a lot of small examples of his vanity, but the most interesting thing here is that he seems most insulted by the idea that people might think he's fat, and he's only a little bothered by people thinking he's molesting kids. Next up we have a two-parter. The gang gets whacked, and starting off he seems almost willing to prostitute himself if the women he bangs are attractive, but the most interesting part is the manipulation he's subjected to by Frank. It's reasonable to assume this may have brought some mental trauma with it, because as we find out in a later episode, Dennis was likely sexually exploited by an older woman in his childhood. Even though this was written into his character later on, I think it's fair to consider it now. Even if they weren't considering this a future plot point when writing this particular episode, I think we can note it while analyzing his character. I mean, a victim of childhood sexual exploitation by an older woman that later goes on to be prostituted to older women would likely suffer some sort of trauma from it. And considering Dennis's comment about might want to set up a doctor's appointment when he mentions some sort of ass play, I think it's safe to assume some shit happened that Dennis would like to forget. Well, since we spent so long on this season already, we won't dwell too long on the last 2 episodes of this season. In episode 14, he gets hooked on the sense of power that he gets from impersonating a cop, and in episode 15, he's not only willing to destroy a marriage by trying to bang an engaged woman, but then makes it very clear he sees the woman as expendable anyway, at least in regards to winning the competition. Alright, I'm going to try to move a little faster now since we're getting some of the baseline stuff down. So on to season 4, and in the first episode he makes a big deal about how his nipples are getting hard at the idea of hunting a man. Not really that important, but yeah. In episode 2, he tries to stress that he is both the brains and the looks of the group. In episode 3, we get another potent example of his belief that he hasn't peaked yet. Mac even has this small comment where he lets us know that Dennis has been talking about this modeling thing for years. We get this line.
Well, I like to think I've been this handsome since birth, possibly even earlier.
And in episode 4, we see him attached to the idea that he is best friends with both Mac and Charlie, and it's made pretty clear that he cares more about the status of best friend than he does about the friendship itself. In episode 5 and 6, Dennis spends much of the episode attempting to have anonymous sex and talks about how interested he is in this idea. And later he doesn't seem to care if Dee actually had been murdered or not. In episode 7, during Artemis's attempt at explaining what happened and who made which poop, she claims that Dennis always listens to Mac's phone calls. While we're not really sure if this actually happens, it's not refuted, so I think it's a safe assumption that it probably does. In episode 8, he seems very invested in the new TV and considers it important because it's a status symbol, and later stresses to the reviewer that he wants to hear him say positive things about his possessions. Episode 9 brings up the fact that he wrote memoirs filled with lies and exaggerations about his sexual exploits, and that he seems extremely proud of them. I'm not sure if these are some sort of attempt at coping wherein he tries to fabricate the identity of a sexual god in some weird attempt to reinterpret the fact that he was sexually exploited as a minor or something, but the memoirs are extremely interesting. Then later he has these hallucinations with Rob Thomas and Sinbad, and I honestly don't know if these celebrities are important to Dennis in any way or not. But either way, he still suffered some fucking bad head trauma to cause the hallucinations to be that vivid and last for quite some time. I also don't know if this comment is related to the head trauma.
I use this fountain for its healing powers. Plus, it does wonders for my skin. But that's not important.
But moving on. Episode 10 begins with his absolute lack of concern for his sister when she has a heart attack in front of him. That being said, nobody else seems to care either. The rest of the episode has several examples of both his vanity and his laziness. The rest of Season 4 doesn't really have anything huge worth noting. Just a few examples of stuff we've already covered. Let's move right into Season 5, where we won't be seeing as many episodes that are a goldmine of insight into Dennis's personality, but rather a lot of little small things to take note of along the way. In episode 1, we get this extremely specific list of hypothetical scenarios.
Look, yeah, okay, absolutely. We could cave the husband's skull in here. Yes, we could take the wife down to the basement, have a frenzied free-for-all with her. We could tie the kids up in their little rooms upstairs so they wouldn't hear any of it.
We'd have to kill the kids because they would have seen our faces.
Right, we could smear the walls with their blood. Guys, there are any number of twisted scenarios that could play out here.
In episode 2, really the only new thing that we can comment on that's somewhat interesting is that he enjoys bartering. Episode 3 doesn't really have anything new to take note of either, and in episode 4 we see him encourage Frank to keep going despite Frank clearly being off the deep end. In episode 5 he doesn't really care about Charlie's feelings, he mostly just gets worried once he thinks Charlie might go postal and kill him if he finds out the waitress is getting married. On to episode 6, and the only thing I really noted was that he was super competitive when Max said he could do more push-ups than him. And there's nothing in episode 7 worth noting, so we'll move on. In episode 8, there's the Patty's thong thing, and I can't explain why he felt the need to wear it to demonstrate it. Plus we get this.
Feel the weight of a real gun in your mouth. You want to taste the metal. You want to feel the steel, man, you know?
Okay, bro, new plan.
Then the frame bang thing, which he basically doesn't think it's rape as long as he does it sweetly or some shit. Episode 9, we get a great idea of how codependent Mac and Dennis are. Apparently he's dependent on Mac's bossiness, even though we don't really see that dependency manifest much in other episodes. A more obvious interpretation of Dennis's dependency on Mac is Mac's submissive nature around Dennis, which allows Dennis to sort of force his golden god status into reality without question when around Mac. In episode 10, all I wrote was the entire episode, because it covers his system for manipulating women. This episode has huge implications for the Machiavellian category of his issues. In order to avoid redundancy, I'm not going to harp on this episode because this is a fucking big and obvious one. Episode 11 is odd because he basically wants to switch Mac and Charlie's script with his own version of a porno with a heavy focus on
Outrageous sexual experiments.
Episode 12 has him urinating in the rival's bar and shows some of the best early example of his obsession with people regarding him as a legend, though it's likely exacerbated by the Ritterol he takes. And then there's the banana ass thing.
I'd take a banana and stick it up some guy's ass in front of his best friend, and I'd be like, "Hey, banana ass, how you doing?"
And finally mentioning something about sticking the tip of his dick in the mouth of someone while sleeping.
Or maybe I'd take the tip of my penis and stick it in a guy's mouth for like just a second. You know what I mean? Like while he was sleeping. I'm all about that shit.
Anyway, on to Season 6. Episode 1 begins his strange saga with Maureen Ponderosa, and aside from plenty of small traits being reinforced, it's the most noticeable part of this episode because he basically just gets married on a whim, whether in an attempt to satisfy his high school fantasies or for some other reason. Either way, it leads to him mentioning having feelings again, and he talks about the shell he built up around himself.
Yeah, I have feelings every single day of my life.
Do you?
Are you saying you don't have feelings?
Well, I'm saying I built up a shell around myself. A cold, calculated, heartless shell that couldn't be broken by anything but marriage. And that's what she did, dude. She broke that shell with marriage. In a good way, if I'm being unclear.
I guess year 1 psych students can fucking go crazy with that. In episode 2, he basically forces Mac to throw him a bachelor party after kicking him out of his apartment, and then obviously has his divorce, which financially hurts him for quite some time. In episode 3, he mentions that being focused on something for a few days is a level of focus that he's never experienced, plus the infamous implications scene. Also, he immediately assumes that he and Mac are the tasty treats that the boating guys are talking about, which is a little odd that they would jump to that immediately. Episode 4 didn't have anything of note, so on to episode 5, which shows him believing that he's high class because he was born upper class, and spends the entire episode trying to validate this belief. In episode 6, he says he isn't going to take care of Frank when he's old. Dennis seems to insert himself as mediator immediately. He's very willing to tell Frank how to sabotage Dee's recovery in order to get what he wants. Episode 7 doesn't really have anything too special, and episode 8 has that small weird thing about Dennis having the most refined palate, and he weirdly chooses everyone's food, but I don't think that's a point that's really brought up ever again, but whatever. Episode 9 doesn't have anything to mention. In episode 10, he followed Mac and exchanged the gift Mac picked out for him for something he wanted instead. In episode 11, Charlie says that Dennis is like a serial killer. Dennis mentions he's always wearing a little bit of foundation and that he always checks girls' license to confirm their age. In episode 12, he's very against the baby leading to him having more responsibilities, even though he later sort of comes around to the idea. He also has that anger outburst where he mentions fucking Thor. It's not really sure if that's relevant, but it fits into the idea that he considers his importance to be that of a god, I suppose. Episode 13 reinforces the idea of his childhood shaping his personal development in a very negative way because it covers Frank ruining his Christmas every year. Also, Frank mentions that his mom is a pillhead in the little home video, so that's also something. On to Season 7, which has several key episodes to look at. The first episode that's pretty important is episode 2. We get to learn several things about his childhood memories of the Jersey Shore, and that he has very fond memories of them, and he actually seems to cherish these. While there's a lot of small things in this episode, the most important thing to take away is that the episode shows that Dennis now has a dear childhood memory effectively ruined. He's seen a place he loved become a shithole. He talks about under the boardwalk being near to his heart, and now forever has a memory of 2 homeless people banging tied to it. He now shares these warm memories with fucked up encounters of doing angel dust with strangers, liquor store robberies, and even murders. He even says by the end of the episode that there's no meaning to life anymore. It's pretty clear his psychological state suffered during this episode. Now on to episode 4, where he seems sort of proud of his manipulative abilities over Mac and Charlie, but more importantly we get this conversation about his god hole that he tries to fill constantly, and he even refers to himself as emotionless here. Following the trend of even episodes being the only ones that matter in this season, we move on to episode 6, where a couple important things happen. The first being his anger regarding girls lying to him about having boyfriends. The whole contract thing is very questionable and worth noting. There are several episodes later on where it seems like Jackie DiNardo is very important in his psyche. Whether it represents what he believes to be the only woman that actually makes him nervous, or that he believes her to actually be the perfect woman, that's kind of hard to know. But there's clearly a place in his subconscious dedicated specifically to her. On to episode 8, where we see his very obsessive reaction to being shushed in a bar. Oddly enough, and it's probably worth noting, that he mentions that he could be a madman with a trunk full of zip ties, which has payoff later in the season when we see that yes, in fact, he does have a trunk full of zip ties, among other things. Moving on to episode 10, we are treated to the fragility of his intense ego. Well, I could harp on about this for a while. I'll just keep it short and say that he basically goes into full depression mode after fearing his looks are fading. Episode 11 has a few things, but the biggest of which is him realizing that he has a tape of him trying to seduce a 16-year-old girl. While it's pretty heavily implied in the tape recording that he stopped right after he learned she was 16, he still has the tape. Anyway, on to the big daddy of this season, the two-parter, episode 12 and 13. We get a big example of his obsession with status and his potentially warped view of his teenage years. He believes himself to be a golden god, and to have been a golden god since high school, but according to Tim Murphy and other people from his teen years, basically the opposite is true. But apparently his obsession and belief in being a golden god was present as early as high school, according to this.
Dude, listen to yourself. Nobody turned anybody against you. I mean, you were never that cool to begin with.
Seriously, man, he would just come around saying weird shit about being a golden god or some other insane crap, and referring to all of us as your minions.
You always acted like you were better than everybody else, but then you'd just go and you'd hang out with Ronnie the Rat or Dirt Grub under the bleachers or behind a dumpster or something. It was really weird.
He also shows even more disrespect of marriage as he tries to fuck Tim Murphy's black wife in an attempt at revenge. When he fails, he starts ranting about them paying the ultimate price and runs out to his car, and this is the payoff I was talking about from a few episodes ago, where we see him have a trunk full of questionable items, including those zip ties. He says it's fetish shit, and it may very well be, but I guess we can't really say for sure. Regardless, this episode has a lot of smaller stuff I skipped over too, just to save time. But we'll move on to Season 8 anyway. Season 8 gives us plenty to work with. In Episode 1, we learn that his grandfather was an extremely questionable influence, and we don't really know the extent that he was influenced by him as a kid, but it's something to consider. I didn't find much of interest in Episode 2, but Episode 3 adds more to the saga of Maureen and Dennis, and when he ends up banging her, it's pretty clear that that fucking wreck of a woman dwells on Dennis's mind at least a little bit. We also learn that even when it comes to women he hates, he's very easily persuaded by big old bazungas. Although in my notes I wrote bunzungas because I was probably drunk. Episode 4 is interesting because he seems to unintentionally try to seduce Charlie's new girlfriend. Either that or he just tries to do it anyway, and only after that fails does he conclude that she's definitely using Charlie. Also, he was clearly so bothered by her comment about him being pale that he almost immediately goes to a tanning bed. Once again reinforcing how easily his vanity can become insecurity if questioned even slightly. Episode 5, and oh boy, it's the therapy episode. There is a fucking absurd amount in this episode, from the fact that he considers himself on par with the psychologist in qualifications, to the psychological profile he has on every member of the gang, all the way to the fact that this whole episode very strongly points to the fact that almost every emotional or personal dynamic of the gang is being manipulated by Dennis constantly. It's too much to completely cover here. Every time I watch it, I just notice another little small thing about Dennis, and every other character for that matter. The fortunate part, though, is that most of it is just reinforced character traits. We're getting to the point in the show where it's less about the new traits they show us and more about trying to keep track of which traits are the most in control of his personality. However, this part right here...
To be in someone's mind, to have complete control. It's like the thrill of being near the executioner's switch. Knowing that at any moment, you could throw it. But knowing you never will. But you could. Never isn't the right word, because I could. And I might. I probably will.
That's definitely worth noting. It's a very clear admission of the fact that his Machiavelli nature is not only something that he thinks very highly of, but he's also very aware of. On to episode 6, which has a large focus on how little Dennis is capable of feeling. He even goes so far as to fake a spiritual awakening to see if he could shake some kind of feeling loose, but he doesn't succeed at it. Later in the episode, we see, however, that he's definitely capable of that feeling after he digs up his mother's grave. He even says that he feels too much here. This is pretty important to remember because the default opinion for a lot of people is that Dennis is an unfeeling psychopath. But not only does he frequently feel both anger and insecurity, he can most definitely feel sorrow and emotional pain. Anyway, episode 7 is not only an example of how far Dennis will go with his deception, but also how much he enjoys it. Enough to be ready to bang a small Asian boy and have what is strongly implied to be an orgasm after he's caught.
Oh my god, it was amazing. It was mostly sexual.
Anyway, episode 8, we get a few small things that I'm not really sure about. He seems very irritated that people aren't investing time in reality. But sometimes I watch this episode and I feel like he doesn't really give a shit about whether or not it's real. It's just that he exists in reality and wants to be experienced. But I really can't say for sure on that one. But there's plenty of stuff in here that's noteworthy beyond that, like watching his own sex tapes makes him feel powerful, and the big one is the sensory deprivation tank. Not only does he experience vivid and symbolic hallucinations in the tank, but his inner and somehow British version of himself tells him that he's a god, and then he proceeds to blow himself in his own vision. There's potentially something to dig into here. At the start of the episode, he even says,
Rule the world, huh? Yeah, if that happens, I'll blow myself.
the first reaction I think is to just think of it like karma and a joke delivery. So if you look at this beyond just the lens of this is a joke and this is why it was written and how it was structured, you can kind of dig into this a lot more. This is his vision. His mind produced it. And yeah, like I said, you can just chalk it up to comedy writing, but if we're really going to analyze Dennis, we can't use that explanation here. So there's a lot of ways to read this, but pretty much all of them end up with deep-seated narcissism as the likely cause, at least in my unprofessional opinion. So we'll skip the symbolic exploration to save time, but I'll just say that I like to read this realization as him sort of adopting the ideal of, I can make anyone do anything I want. Because, I mean, if he considers himself a god, and he can even make himself do things he wants, then he can make anyone who's not a god do things, right? Anyway, that could be like, just really autistic over-analysis, but whatever. Anyway, his next move is just go and delete all their accounts so they'll go back to doing what he wants, so I like to think my theory is supported. Moving on, episode 9 is pretty much 20 minutes of narcissism. Basically anything I could mention from this episode could be summed up with that, so we'll move along. Episode 10, the two things we can take note of is that it reinforces the fact that he never willingly accepts blame, and of course his temper. His temper gradually just gets more extreme throughout the series, but this is a good place to remind ourselves of, its acceleration. And on to season 9, where we are getting a lot less subtle. In episode 1, he wants to find a very below average man for Dee, keeps denying her career and telling her it will fail, even when it looks very much like it's going to succeed. Tells her that she will never succeed, and eventually even breaks down and does some weird thing where he says that he's her perfect select and that he loves her, and we can't truly tell if it's genuine, or the more likely explanation is that he's just lying once he's worried that she's going to be successful without him and he won't have any part in it. Also, he seems very mentally fucked up by the reveal of the fake success. Potentially even as much or more than Dee. On to episode 2, which really just has these small comments about history of felonious activity and his list. Episode 3 and 4, we really don't get anything to note. In episode 5, there's really only one small thing of importance, and that's his little speech he has while he's high. He comes to the conclusion that Mac is ruining his afterlife. He believes that he doesn't really hate God, he just hates Mac. I've smoked enough of the devil's lettuce to interpret that little stonerism in my own way, but I'll leave it open-ended here. Episode 6 is a fun one because we get a look into his mind pretty directly. In his vision of saving the store, he suffers a headshot, and within his fantasy, he even has some of the most important memories that would flash into his mind at a potential moment of death, including his sexual conquest of the hippie's girlfriend and the I am God vision from the sensory deprivation tank. Anyway, the other important thing is that he would rather die than have his dick not work. But Jackie DiNardo is capable of giving him the will to live. See, she might represent the only girl that he believed he couldn't get, maybe? It's kind of like he regards her as the one that got away, but it might just be because she makes him super nervous on account of her massive knock wobbles, which might be supported by the fact that he kills her when her breasts were obliterated. But to be fair, it does seem difficult for him.
Rest easy, my angel.
Anyway, Does it feel like we're on a fucking loop? I feel like we're looping through. Episode 7 just kind of confirms the severity of his alcoholism, along with some strange sort of obsession with being perfect for his Boys to Men performance. Small things are that he insists he can go from flaccid to erect at a moment's notice, and believes he can just will away the sickness. Episode 8 really only took note of like 2 things here, and only one was worth mentioning. It's that he gets high off gasoline as if he's done it before, which he probably has. One small thing in episode 9, and it's just the pride he takes in knowing all the sex positions and being able to do them. Episode 10 has a few big things. Firstly, this quote.
Well, Frank, once something's in writing, that means it's set in stone. Then no one can do anything to stop me.
Then, of course, his inability to admit guilt or apologize even when it will clearly get him what he wants. And lastly, it's definitely worth noting that it was Dennis who had the idea to lock people inside a fucking burning apartment. So, that's pretty goddamn dark. Anyway, season 10! Now, this season contains a few of the more important moments and insights, so it might take a little longer. The one in particular that's the strangest for me is that upon seeing a single frat kid order one single beer, he feels the need to take him entirely out of the picture in order to protect a drinking game that he barely participates in the first place. I'm not even sure how to categorize this, but it's an example of a very warped priority system. Later he goes to obsessive lengths to find an ideal target to plow, only to bang the woman he considered to be far beneath him later on. He also shows no worry that the kid that Frank drugged might die, but to be fair, Frank doesn't really care either. And of course, I'll just leave this here.
You're weird.
You have no idea.
And on to episode 2, which is really important if you're trying to make the case that his narcissism is basically crippling. He almost can't function when he gets feedback that conflicts with his self-image, and eventually just stops caring about the women and only pursues the rating. It's got plenty of other small things, and it reinforces plenty of other things, but this is the big point. Anyway, episode 3, and we're going to start feeling a little more redundant as it goes on. This episode has one of the more important outbursts we see from Dennis, along with one of the most important pieces of information we need to consider. I'll just play the clip.
D, I swear you would be of more use to me if I skinned you and turned your skin into a lampshade. Or fashioned you into a piece of high-end luggage. I could even add you to my collection.
Are you saying that you have a collection of skin luggage?
Of course I'm not, Dee. Don't be ridiculous. Think of the smell. You haven't thought of the smell, you bitch! Now you say another word, and I swear to God, I will dice you into a million little pieces. And put those pieces in a box. A glass box. That I will display on my mantle.
Now, it's implied that this leads the doctor to prescribe him with borderline personality disorder. Now, I know what a few of you are thinking, and maybe this is enough for the average viewer, you know. Maybe hearing them write a diagnosis for Dennis into the show is enough for them to call the case closed. But I'm not so ready. When we consider that along with bipolar and ADHD, borderline personality disorder is one of the most commonly misdiagnosed mental disorders, it's quite possible that this would just kind of be a reactionary misdiagnosis. I mean, who knows? But considering it was a diagnosis that essentially came from one consultation, it's at least possible that it's a misdiagnosis. I mean, the doctor very likely did not get to see as many examples of his mental state as we have. We, the viewer, are much more informed about his symptoms than this doctor would be. And so I would argue that we get to make the call, and that the doctor's diagnosis was intentionally written as a frequently misdiagnosed condition for this very reason. But you can choose to accept it, and I won't stop you, because how would I? Anyway, episode 4, the main thing we get is an anger outburst where he scratches Mac in the face for something extremely minimal. Episode 5 has the very weird implication that he might have been watching porn with Mac and or at least discussing it in depth with him. I don't know. We also figure out he's tasted his semen, so I don't know. This shit's getting weirder. Episode 6 has Mac accusing Dennis in his harsh judgment of being the reason that he changed who he was at the core. And the rest of the episode is filled with Dennis trying to control his anger and blaming the gang for his newly found short fuse. He's later personally offended at the idea that his Range Rover is a starter car, potentially because there's an underlying implication that he's peaked within that opinion of his car. But overall, this episode supports the idea that he's very codependent with the rest of the gang. Episode 7 is kind of an anomaly because of how much he seems bothered by depressing things, and you wouldn't really expect this from someone many people consider a full-on psychopath, so anyway. Episode 8 contains Dennis having a televised mental breakdown, and it seems to be brought on by either failure or humiliation, or more likely both. Episode 9 shows him conceiving a plan to screw Frank out of money years in advance, and seemingly on a whim, and didn't even think this was the least bit weird that 7 years ago he came up with this plan based entirely on seeing some dude in a Wawa that looked like Mexican Frank. Anyway, in episode 10 we get even more Machiavellian stuff as he not only creates a cult to get Mac to stop eating Thin Mints, but he's also proud of his talent for manipulation once again, and he's arguably the reason that someone set themselves on fire. Anyway, we're rolling into Season 11 and only a few more to go. But Season 11 actually has several important points. In Episode 1, Dennis sculpts a head in a freezer to represent love. In Episode 2, he's willing to take advantage of Frank's memory loss to try to steal his money. He also wants to become a vet pretty much exclusively because he finds animal skins fascinating, and also relapses on crack. Episode 3 has nothing of note. Episode 4, we learn that he was very likely pressured into sex by a teacher, and is still in denial about it. This could easily explain his desire to seduce younger women, so he can recreate his first sexual experience, but this time he's the authority figure. Anyway, episode 5's a big one. From the very first chirp of the smoke detector, he pretends not to hear it. He's willing to gaslight Mac for seemingly no reason at all. He listens to Summer of '69 in every car ride for a whole month, or at least every car ride we see. His anger becomes harder and harder to control. Both Mac and Dennis were storing their trash in a room in the house, and they make no mention of it ever. He hallucinates stripping naked and threatening his neighbor, and I think it's worth considering that Wally might not have ever even really been there at any point after the first time he greeted Dennis and Mac. And by the end of the episode, he definitely is completely willing to go through with killing Wally. Episode 6 really has nothing important. Episode 7 has a tiny bit, but it's not really worth mentioning. Episode 8, he participates in kidnapping and robbing people at gunpoint for the whole episode. And there's this little line where he says this.
I don't want to be on your weird website.
Well, if you don't comply with me, then you're gonna end up on the weird one, okay? So smile!
Which suggests he either runs or posts on some extremely questionable websites. In episode 9, we get an example of how he goes about seducing a woman on a boat with the previously mentioned implications, and it's predictably filled with intimidation. Episode 10 shows us that Dennis carries around a piece of onion to elicit tears. We also learned he ripped up the letters that Mac's dad sent him from prison. Anyway, episode 1 is kind of fuzzy because it's not exactly clear how in reality it is, but luckily there really isn't any insight in this episode to consider, so we'll move on. Episode 2 is interesting because although Dennis goes to the water park explicitly to bang mothers, he abandons that entirely when Abby steals something from him. He spends the rest of this episode very genuinely enjoying his time teaching this girl how to lie and steal. He not only shows pride in this, but calls it an art. But the most important thing to take from this is that he values his Machiavellianism even more than some easy poontang. And he may be a deviant, but this is an example of him thinking something's more valuable than getting laid. Not only that, but he does seem very sincere in this moment.
That bothers me. A genius whose fate is controlled by an idiot?
You think I'm a genius?
Yes. Yes, I think you're a genius. Are you kidding me? When I was your age, I couldn't have accomplished half the things you did today.
On to episode 3, and the only things of note here are the power he enjoys from running the show, that he calls himself a genius, and that he can't enjoy it when the people being filmed know they're being filmed. This could be interpreted as simply a craving of a specific novelty or some kind of voyeurism power trip, but, you know, it's definitely something. Anyway, episode 4, all I wrote in my notes was doesn't like dog, and I don't really feel like going back in and figuring out why I thought that was important. So, episode 5 is full of stuff, as the entire episode is basically dedicated to showing Dennis's dark personality traits. He requested to draw his own blood. He stared at that camera for 2 fucking hours.
2 hours. Never moved. Never blinked. Gives me goosebumps just thinking about it.
Snapped the neck of a crow as a kid, snapped the head clean off. Also,
Well, yes, there was a third crow, and a fourth, if you must know, but who likes crows?
And finally, Frank wasn't around much when Dennis was a kid. We already kind of knew that, but still, this supports it even more and doubles down on the possibility that he probably does have an attachment disorder. Moving on to episode 6. Are you getting tired of me saying moving on? Anyway, he has a particularly weird sub-story where we learn that Dennis basically attempts to remotely groom a convenience store cashier through D. He also seems to calculate the contents of Dee's purse with very little effort. Whether that means he snoops around in her purse or just knows what's in there, I guess could be up to speculation. Episode 7 shows us that he still denies that he was raped, but also clearly still suffers from some kind of repressed trauma from the incident. Also, you can read into the specifics of his stripping act if you want. It's really fucking weird.
Hey, boy, let's have a catch.
Over here, Pop.
Hey, good throw, son.
I love you, Dad.
I love you too, son.
Oh?
And even though I never even said it enough,
What is
I
this?
wasn't a good I wasn't a good father to you, and I regret that now.
No, that's fine, because now is our chance to connect.
This is super weird.
Episode 8, the only thing he ever wanted was a rocket launcher. How sweet. And there's nothing of note in episode 9. Anyway, episode 10 is kind of an oddball that it's almost like a fucking fever dream for me. I mean, at some point he ran off and had a kid under the Brian Lefebvre alias. He seems to have actual emotional effect when saying his goodbye to this kid and even leaves to go be a dad at the end of the episode. I have no fucking clue what to make of this because in episode 1 of season 13, he comes back. So I don't know. Anyway, the rest of season 13, episode 1 is pretty much constant examples of what kind of imprint Dennis has on the gang. But my favorite way to interpret this is that he's using the Dennis system on them as a group, specifically in regards to how he clearly nurtured dependents in the group, neglected them emotionally, and even separated entirely for a while. It's not a perfect fit, but I like this interpretation more than just speculating on writing deadlines for explaining some of this weird shit. Anyway, all we really get in episode 2 is a look at his sexualized take on an escape room and some pissing contests between him and Frank. Skipping episode 3 because there's nothing of note, we get to episode 4, which is one giant example of his Machiavellianism because he orchestrated this whole event as a shield against future sexual harassment allegations. And then on to episode 5, which is a look at how he views his car as a status symbol and how much his personality is a reflection of that. I know we're kind of repeating points here, but you know, just for completion's sake. Anyway, the rest of the episodes in this season either have nothing or don't even have Dennis in them, which is likely one of the many reasons I really didn't enjoy much of this season. I'm also going to admit season 14 because it's still somewhat new, and I think we already have plenty to work with, and there's really only a few things that I saw in season 14 that I would have included in this anyway, so I'll just admit them now to prevent any spoilers. So now we come to the tricky part. I'm not a psychologist, and this task is made even harder by the fact that many of the traits of psychopaths, narcissists, sociopaths, and anything else you might consider Dennis to be are all extremely similar. There's a lot of overlap. You could say he exhibits many of the warning signs for psychopathy, and you'd be right. But you could say the same thing for several other mental disorders. I'll just mention the part I consider to be guaranteed, which is that he definitely has an attachment disorder. Probably reactive attachment disorder, which based on my 7 minutes of Googling means it's 100% right and there's no way it could be wrong. He hits the majority of the checkboxes and has a childhood that seems pretty textbook for this kind of thing. So now we gotta look at his dark triad characteristics, and typical of many individuals that display these traits, it's a combination of all three, which makes things more difficult. We could just say that he's all of them and call it, job well done. He's a Machiavellian narcissistic psychopath with an attachment disorder. Which is true, but I feel like there has to be a winner. We have to pick one, or at least I have to pick one. And a case can easily be made for any of them. Machiavellianism is obviously a great fit. He uses obscenely elaborate manipulation constantly, sometimes planning across nearly a decade. Psychopathy also fits very neatly. He has the background, the childhood killing of small animals, and fits basically every symptom and warning sign. But this is also true for narcissism, which just makes this more difficult. He's a perfect fit for any of these. We can take a look at his childhood and adolescence and see which traits appeared first and try to determine it in that way, but This has a similar conundrum. As a child, he killed those crows, but he also started a psychological profile on his sister in kindergarten, which fits Machiavellianism, and thought he was a golden god at the very least during high school, possibly earlier, which fits narcissism. We can try to look at the potential causes of his mental state, but it's hard to pinpoint one because we have the influence of his mother's favoritism, which likely fed his self-image while she was simultaneously in and out of his life, along with his father figure, likely leading to his attachment disorder. Then there's the statutory rape he endured, likely being a repressed trauma that led to his sexual deviancy and power fantasies. The difficulties just go on, but I can't be satisfied without picking a main and defining characteristic. If I had to pick just one, and I do, it would be narcissism. In my eyes, narcissism is not only the most frequent and constant personality trait he displays, but most importantly, it's also the strongest motivator for his use of Machiavellianism, his bouts of anger, his depression. In fact, most of his emotional outbursts or decisions seem fueled by his narcissism. While he's definitely psychopathic and is relying on Machiavellianism, he's constantly motivated and crippled by his narcissism. It seems to be the most influencing of these three traits on his life. His ups and downs are almost entirely dictated by it. The other two dark triad characteristics just kind of seem to only be in service of his narcissism. So, there. That's my answer. I mean, probably a little anticlimactic, but I always knew it might be. It was fun. It was fun to rewatch the whole series and pay exclusive attention to the development of a single character. You know, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not qualified in any way, but, you know, and this could be a pretty textbook diagnosis of something else, but I'm just some dude that likes Sunny. I like when a stupid little comedy series develops a character from just a simple asshole into an entire nutcase over more than a decade. The extra little effort in this show always goes such a long way, and even if I have been a little disappointed in the past 2 seasons, I really can't complain too much because so much of this show will remain amazing for many years to come. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a great day.